So I climbed into the front seat, and I asked my dad, "What's that light up there?" And he said, "What light?" And I said, "The light up there." And he looked out the window, and he could see this thing, and by this time it had gotten pretty close to us, and it was flying at treetop level and matching our speed. And when my dad saw it, he went into instant panic mode. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Shut up, leave me alone." And he was, I could see he was visibly frightened. And so anyway, we tried to outrun it. And there's no way we could outrun it. It matched our speed. And there didn't seem to be anybody on this road at all. And there were trees around us, like pine trees. And so all of a sudden the ship shot ahead of us, and quite a distance, and it came down in the road. So when we got close to it, I don't know if the engine stopped or if my dad just stopped, but he stopped, and this thing was sitting right in front of us in the middle of the road. And it was very bright. It lit up the whole road and the trees and everything, almost like daylight. And so we were both looking at this thing, and all of a sudden my dad managed to collect himself. And he said to me, he says, "You stay here in the car." He said, don't you leave the car. You stay here and stay low so they don't see you. He said, "Don't look out the window over the dash, just stay low." He says, "I'm going to get out and see what they want." So anyway, these two beings came out of the ship, and they're standing in the road just looking at us. And my dad opened the door, and he got out, and he starts walking toward them. Well, I was just a little kid, and I was very curious. So, of course, I was looking over the dashboard and watching this going on. And I could see him talking to the two beings. And the one was in front, talking to him, and the other one was over that being's left shoulder, kind of behind a little bit, maybe a few feet back. And so I wanted to see who these people were, because they looked different from us, and I was interested. And so I climbed over to the driver's seat, and I got out. And I knew that I was probably going to be in trouble for it, but little kids can get away with a lot of stuff, And so I started walking toward my dad, and I could see him turning his body to guard me so that the beings wouldn't see me. And he had his hand behind his back, and he was going like that, to, get back in the car kind of motion. And so I came up behind him, and he was still trying to guard me so the being couldn't see me. And the being just suddenly went like that and looked over his shoulder at me. And he said, I could hear in my mind, I could hear this being saying, "You seem to be concerned about the child." And so my dad's kind of laughed this. When he's nervous, he kind of has this sheepish sort of laugh. And he said, "Oh yeah," he says, "that's my boy." And then he turned to me and he said, "I told you to stay in the car. Now go and get back in the car." And I said, "But I want to see." And he says, "Go and get back in the car." So then the being that was talking to my dad said, "Would you like my crew member to take him back for you?" And my dad said, "No, well, that's okay. We have to go anyway." And so the being turned and looked at his crew member, and the crew member immediately came over and took me by the hand and started walking me back to the car. So my dad was looking at us, watching him take me back to the car. And I could see he was nervous about it, wondering, like, what's going to happen here. And so, anyway, I got in, and the being got in beside me and sat in the driver's seat. And so he shut the door, and he was sitting there looking at me. And he started asking me questions. He said, "How does this vehicle work?" And I said, "Well, you push the one pedal on the floor there to make it go, and you push the other one to make it stop." And he said, "Oh, I see." And so he's kind of holding the steering wheel, and he goes, "What does this do?" And I said, "Well, that's how you move the vehicle. You either go that way or that way with it, and depending on how you turn it." And he said, "Oh, okay." And then he pointed to the radio on the dashboard. And I just happened to glance up, and I noticed that my dad and the other being were no longer there. So I assumed that he'd taken him inside. And he pointed to the radio, this being, and he says, "What does this do?" And I said, "Well, that's a radio." And I said, you hear music on it and you hear people talking." And he says, "Oh." And he said, can you talk back to them on it?" And I said, "No, it doesn't work that way. It only works one way. You can hear on it, but you can't talk on it." And he says, "Oh, okay." And he said, "How do you start the vehicle?" And I said, "Well, you have to put the key in here." And he was just keeping me occupied and basically babysitting me while my dad was on the ship with the other being. So he kept me amused there for maybe about 20 minutes or so, asking me questions about school. He said, "Do you go to school?" And I said, "Well, no, not yet, but next year." So that means I would have had to have been about 4, because I would have started school at 5. So I would have had to have been 4 years old, I guess, at that time. So anyway, he kept me amused for quite a while. And then I saw my dad get out and the other being. They both came out of the ship, and they're standing there talking in the road. And the being looks at me and he says, "I have to go now." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Can't you stay a little bit longer?" Because I was enjoying his company. He was taking an interest in me. And he said, "Well, maybe for a minute or so." And then he was watching the other being that was with my dad. And then the other being just kind of nodded at him like that. And he said, "Now I do have to go." And I tried to talk him into staying. And he said, "No, I'm sorry. I do have to go now." So he got out and he's walking toward the other being, past my dad in the road, coming back to the vehicle. And so my dad got in, and he was kind of quiet. And we watched the two beings get back in the saucer-shaped craft. It was saucer-shaped. And it lifted off the road, and we watched it lift up, and we watched it take off. And so then my dad started the car, and we started driving home. Then I noticed something kind of unusual, is that this ship appeared to be coming back, and it came back and did the same thing. It came down in the road in front of us and made us stop again. And my dad, I heard him kind of mutter under his breath, "Oh, what the hell do they want now?" And so one being got out, walked over to the car, and my dad stayed in the car this time. He didn't get out. The being came over to the window and motioned for my dad to lower the window. So my dad rolled the window down, and he said, "What is it?" And the being said, "You forgot these." And he handed him his glasses. And so my dad said, "Oh, thanks." And he put his glasses on, and then the being went back to the ship, and they left again. So that was the end of that incident. But the one that I've talked about a little more often is one that I call the van incident. And this happened when I was about maybe 14, or between 14 and 16, I think, somewhere in that range. And I was in a band with some friends of mine from school. And there was, we had just played at the American Hotel in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I was probably about 16, I guess, or maybe 17. I know I was underage, but they never asked my age. And so we were the house band there for a little while. And so I played there, and we finished our gig. All of a sudden, this guy walks up to us, and nobody seemed to know who he was. But he had long hair, like maybe down a little past his shoulders, and he was wearing jeans and a jacket. And he said, "Are you guys by any chance going to St. Catharines?" And we said, "Yeah." And he said, "Would it be okay if I grabbed a lift with you?" And so the driver was our guitarist. I'll call him Tom. And he said, sure. He says, you have to sit in the back with the equipment, though. And he said, yeah, that's no problem. So we all piled into the van, and we left the party. And there was, in the front seat, there was Tom, the guitarist. There was Sam, our drummer. And those were the two seats. In the back, it was just like a cargo van. But there was one window in the side of it. And in the back was myself and the bass player, which I'll call Calvin, and the girlfriend of the drummer, which I'll call Anne Marie, and this guy that we picked up that needed a ride. And we were sitting in the back there with the amps and all the drums and everything, and so we went to get on the Queen Elizabeth Highway, and the entrance was closed for some reason. And so we decided to take the service road, the North Service Road, go down to the next entrance and get on there. So that's what we did. We got on the North Service Road to the Queenie, and we were driving along and all sitting in the back talking. And so then all of a sudden Tom stops the van. And we said, why are you stopping? And he says, well, you guys are going to have to take a look at this because you're not going to believe me. So I looked over the seat. We all kind of looked over the seats, and we saw, again, a saucer-shaped craft sitting in the middle of the road. And it was quite a bit ahead of us. We stopped back far enough that we didn't think it could see us. And he said, what do you think it is? And I was thinking, well, maybe it's a movie prop. Maybe they're doing a movie here. And he says, yeah, but it's like 2 or 3 in the morning. Like, why would they be filming a movie at 3 in the morning? And all the lights were on this thing. There were like lights around the perimeter of it, and lights coming out the bottom of it that seemed to be panning back and forth over the pavement. And it had portholes in the sides of it, and recessed portholes. So anyway, he says, what should we do? And I think it was Sam that suggested, well, maybe we should turn around and go back and take the back road home instead. So that's what we agreed on, because we didn't want to get too close to this thing, because we didn't know what it was. And so anyway, we start driving ahead, and we're not turning. So I said, how come we're not turning? And he says, well, look, he says, I'm turning the steering wheel. I've got it cranked all the way over, and it's not moving. Like we were heading straight for this thing. And I noticed that I couldn't feel any of the bumps in the road that you normally feel when you're driving. So it must have levitated us up slightly off the road. And I said, well, put on the brake. And he says, I'm pumping the brake. He says, look, nothing's happening. And the van was still moving toward this thing. And we were approaching it pretty fast, to the point where I was bracing myself for impact, because I didn't know if we were going to hit it or what, And we're all kind of panicking, and everybody was terrified because we didn't know what the heck was going on. And it brought us right up to it, to maybe about 20 or 30 feet away from it. And then we settled on the road, and the van wouldn't start, nothing would work. And we're all panicking in the back. And so the drummer, Sam, kind of became the voice of reason. And he just shouted, everybody shut up. So we all kind of stopped talking, and he said, now, he says, I don't know what this is, but he says, if we remain really quiet and we stay down so they don't see us, he said, maybe they'll leave us alone. And he said, but he says, Tom and I we can't leave our seats because, we're stuck here. So we're just going to face straight ahead, and we'll all remain really quiet and not say anything, and maybe they'll leave us alone. So we all sat there, and you could feel the fear in the back of the van was so tense you could cut it with a knife, you know. And so the drummer, he says, I heard him say, "Oh no." And I said, what's going on? He says, "They're getting out." And I said, "Really?" I said, "I want to see." And he said, "No, stay down, stay down." And I says, "Well, what do they look like?" And he says, "Well, they're just little guys." And so anyway, we could hear them around the van, and they were trying the doors, and we had all the doors locked and everything. And at one point, I saw the profile of an alien head go by the side window of the van. And it shocked me, and I said, "Did you see that?" And everybody went, "Shh, quiet." And I said, "Yeah, but did you see that?" And Anne-Marie said, "Yes, I saw it." So we could hear them trying the back door. And I started looking around for something to hit them with, because I thought, if we get into a fight with these beings, I don't know what they're going to do. And so I grabbed the mic stand, and I was ready for anything that was going to happen. And then the strangest thing happened. This guy that we picked up at the party that nobody knew, he starts looking around, and he was sitting in the back corner of the van. He was looking around at us, and all of a sudden he just reached over and grabbed the handle of the door and opened it. So the back door flung open, and we couldn't believe he'd done that. And there was 3 beings there, at least 3, maybe 4. I can't remember exactly now. But they were standing in a row looking into the van, and the first one in the front, which I assumed to be the leader, he got up and came right into the van through the back door. And so we're all panicking, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed for some reason. And when he came in, he was standing up, and his head was clearing the ceiling by a good 6 inches or so. So he was pretty short, you know. We couldn't stand up in the van, but he could. And so he's looking at us, and I could hear these words in my head. And he said, "I'm sorry, but we had to temporarily paralyze you, because," he said, "I was concerned for the safety of myself and my crew, because you were thinking thoughts of violence." And he said, "We don't mean any violence or any harm to anyone." He said, "All we want to do is run a few tests on 3 of you, and then we'll bring you back and you can be on your way." And so he said, he started looking around, and he looked at the guy that we picked up at the party. He said, "I would like you." And then he looked at our bass player, and you, and then he looked at me. And as soon as his eyes fell upon me, I looked down, because I was afraid he was going to pick me. But my heart was going a mile a minute, because in a way I was hoping he wouldn't pick me, but there was a part of me somehow that knew he was going to. And so I sat there looking down at the ground, and then finally I couldn't stand it anymore, and I looked up, and he was staring straight at me, and I heard him say, "And you." And so he said, "Would you follow me, please?" And he turned around, and he started to go back out through the back door. And as he was leaving, his foot caught in the snare drum stand, knocked the drum over, and it rolled out the back of the van and fell on the ground. And immediately one of the other beings picked it up and started looking at it. And so the leader gets out, and then the bass player and the other guy got out, and then I followed him out. And the being with the drum hands it to the leader, and he took it, and he looks at me, and he says, "Is this yours?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Who does it belong to?" And I said, "Well, it belongs to him." And I pointed to Sam in the driver's seat, and Sam gave me this dirty look like, "Why did you point to me? You know, I don't want to be involved in this." So the leader said to the being that originally picked the drum up, he said, "Go and get him and bring him out." So the other being went over and came back with Sam, got him out, and brought him around to the back of the van. And the leader handed him the drum, and he said, "Is this yours?" And Sam took it, and he said, "Yeah." And he says, "Is it damaged?" And he looked at it, and he says, "No, it doesn't appear to be damaged." And he laid it on the floor of the van. And so anyway, I had a bag of my recorders. They're these instruments here, these wooden instruments that I play. And I had them, they come apart in pieces, and I had them in this burlap bag. And where I go, my instruments go with me. So I grabbed the bag, and he told us to come around to the side of the van. And so I went around the side, and we were all standing there. And now Sam was with us, so there were 4 of us now, rather than just 3. And Anne-Marie and Tom remained inside the van. And so he had us line up along the side of the van, and he says, "I want you to face that way and face the back of the person in front of you." And he said, "We're going on the ship." And he said, "When we go on, we're all going to go together as one unit." And he said, "So when we start to move," he said, "don't look to the left, don't look to the right, look straight ahead." And he said, "And when we go up into the ship," he said, "don't touch the hull." So he went and he stood in front of us, and one of the other beings stood in the back of us. And we all kind of lifted off the ground and started moving, and I thought, wow, this is really strange. And so we're moving toward the ship, and of course I couldn't resist it. I had to turn my head, and so I looked to the left. As soon as I looked to the left, we stopped. And when I faced straight ahead again, we started going again. So I said, oh, that's how it works. And then I tried looking to the right, and we stopped again. And the being never turned around. He just waited. And when I looked straight ahead, we started moving again. So there was, I guess, the 4 of us and the one being in front and the one in the back. So there were 6 of us. And we moved over toward the side of the ship and turned toward it. And I could see there was like a set of what looked like corrugated steps going up into it. And I could see the light inside the ship. And it wasn't like extremely bright. It was kind of subdued. And then we started to turn on an angle and move up. Rather than walking up the stairs, we just went straight up. And as we were going up, I was looking through the handrail at the hull, and I just reached out and just barely touched the surface of the hull like that with my ring finger. And it felt like aluminum or some kind of metal. So when we started going in, the drummer was in front of me, and the archway was made for these little guys. It wasn't made for humans. And my drummer was a tall guy, and he banged his head on the archway going in. And they immediately became very concerned. Are you okay? Are you okay? And he said, yeah, I'm fine. But he wasn't happy at all, didn't want to be there. And so then as soon as we got inside the ship, they separated us. But there's a little part that I should add before I forget, is that where I touched the ship with this finger, about 2 weeks later, I ended up with a huge planter's wart on the surface of my finger. And it took a long time to get rid of it, like a couple of months or so to get rid of it. It was the worst wart I ever had. So anyway, once we were inside, they separated us from each other. So there was basically one being for each of us. And they started asking us to, they said, we need you to remove your clothing so we can do these tests. And so they brought me and the bass player and the other guy, the hitchhiker. They brought us all to this area where there were some benches there. And so we all started to remove our clothing. And I remember seeing somebody with long underwear. and I think it was the hitchhiker, and we thought that was kind of funny to see this guy wearing long underwear. But anyway, the being that was standing in front of me, I asked him if I could keep my underwear on. I just had these briefs, and he said, well, what's underwear? And so I showed him, and he said, yes, you can keep that. And I was afraid to let go of my bag of instruments, and he said, you can put those there with your clothes on the pile of clothing on the floor. And he said, nobody's going to touch them. They'll be fine. You'll be able to see them from where you are. So I put them on the floor, and then he came over with a gurney-like thing and asked me to get up on it. And so I got up on this thing, and I was sitting on it, and he wheeled me over, or pushed me over somehow. I don't know if it had wheels or what. Wasn't really paying attention to that. But he moved me over to this other area of the ship where there was cabinetry, like base cabinets with a countertop on them, and they sort of followed the contour of the ship. And he pushed me over to there, and then he went over to one of the other beings, and the other being had like a little table that seemed to also be metallic, and it had a cloth on the top of it that the being started unrolling it, and inside there seemed to be instruments that looked like surgical instruments. And so while they were discussing what they were going to do, I thought to myself, I've got to see if I can get something from this ship, because nobody's going to believe me when I tell them this. So I looked to see what I could take, and there was these round knobs on the drawers in this cabinet. So I reached down and I grabbed one of the knobs, and I wondered if it would unscrew, and I started turning it, and it was getting loose. So I managed to unscrew it and take it off, and I had it in my hand, and I thought, well, where am I going to put this thing now? I don't have any pockets, and maybe I could hide it in my armpit or something. And so anyway, the being comes back over to me, and he says, we're going to do the test now. And he looked at me kind of funny, and he said, what have you got? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you took something.
Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Defense Minister, General, allow me to introduce myself. My name is François Rousseau. I'm in charge of an informal research group, which does not appear in your organization charts. Our president, to whom I personally and exclusively refer, thought it useful, if not necessary, that I clarify for you a certain number of issues. You think that as initiates you're better informed than most people. Allow me to doubt it. At this very moment, things are taking place. They are somehow serious enough for the informations and documents that I kept for you be revealed to you now. In a word, a manipulative operation unparalleled to this day on a planetary scale is being implemented and will be the final subject of my talk. As regards our era, everything in reality started just before World War II. Hitler had broken certain taboos, such as taking recourse to occultism and secret societies. The Ahnenerbe, a Nazi organization assigned with, among other things, archaeological and anthropological research, found this during an expedition to Afghanistan. This flying object is called Vimana, or Astra, by the Hindus. Moreover, during exploration of the subsoil by the Russians and Chinese in 1927, traces of a very ancient nuclear explosion were detected. Certain sedimentary layers had been atomically vitrified 50,000 years ago. The very same phenomenon can be observed around today's nuclear test sites. One must understand that Hitler, thanks to these discoveries, which he took highly seriously, was going to open a Pandora's box which no government, whether friend or enemy, wished to close afterward. Behind tragic history, which we all know, lies a theory based on the existence of full moons, associated with the four geological cycle. According to Hans Oerbiger, founder of the world ice theory, the Earth had undergone 4 semi-global extinctions of life due to the fall of one of these moons. Effectively, as one goes along, the satellite moved closer, gravity changed and triggered some deep mutation of the genetic standard, thereby creating a race of highly intelligent giants measuring approximately between 10 to 13 feet tall. Several tens of thousands of years later, the moon crashed, the impact causing a serious rise in sea levels and a nuclear-like global winter. This race of giants was to disappear due to a terrestrial gravity which had grown too powerful and incapacitating for their unusual size. Hitler was initiated to these doctrines, and contacts with Tibet in particular were frequent. The Nazis sought contact with the survivors of ancient civilizations, holders of ancient technologies like the previously described Vimanas. One of these civilizations spread out over the entire planet more than 600 pyramids made of stone, earth, and even iron. These pyramids are almost all pointed in the same direction, all have the same proportion as number pi, and all situated in magnetotelluric nodes. The oldest are in Asia. 2 of them are submerged, one south of Japan at Okinawa, another south of Cuba. These 2 were built about 12,000 years ago. I began by this more archaeological reminder for this reason. Our civilization is the 4th of the cycle which I described previously. Yes, I know that might well hurt our pride. We're neither the first nor the last. One must understand that the study and understanding of several recovered prototypes were the absolute priority to ensure Nazis' domination over the skies. The Allies, in parallel, focused on mastering atom and creating the first nuclear bombs. These secret bases were the center of all research supervised by the Nazis. In one of these bases worked Victor Schauberger, father of the Nazis' UFOs. Schauberger headed the Real Society in charge of anti-gravitational research. He died in 1958 in Texas, while working under protection of the United States on the improvement of his own flying saucers, which have since become American. You will quickly understand that 70% of unexplained aerial phenomena are human in origin and in no way extraterrestrial. Once World War II was over and Nazi technology had been systematically plundered by both Americans and Russians, the first challenge was to carry on and even complete the Nazis' research in great secrecy. The program, called Project Rainbow, especially known for the Philadelphia experiment, was the immediate proof. Mathematician von Neumann, who collaborated with Albert Einstein and Nikola Tesla on behalf of the Navy, succeeded in accidentally teleporting a Cannon-class destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge. These photos, supplied by Morris K. Jessup before his suspicious death, are rare testimonies for this unique experiment. In the same time, the first Indo-Aryan technology prototype trials did not go by unnoticed. The military had come up with a more efficient parade than secrecy. At about the same period, Kenneth Arnold, U.S. Air Force pilot and CIA agent, launched the greatest operation in manipulation ever concerning the existence of UFOs. Making people believe they didn't exist was not the right solution and clearly insufficient. Discrediting enemies and frightening the population by systematic misinformation proved far more efficient. UFOs and parahuman belong henceforth to the movies, television, and collective paranoia, and not to the realm of scientists, as it should have been the case. In May 1947, the American Secret Services discovered the existence of an ancient terrestrial UFO secretly recovered by the Russians, which had crashed into the Altai Mountains along their border with Mongolia. Tension between the two blocs immediately rose a serious notch. The discovery was spectacular, and so not to lose face, the Pentagon, in tandem with the CIA, decided to tell lies and imagined a huge bluff to convince both the Russians and the world at large that they too recovered an UFO in Roswell in July 1947. Of course, it wasn't true, but the bluff worked all the same. In February 1949, just after the so-called Roswell incident, an UFO was photographed and filmed in Antarctica. It was the first photo of this type of a cigar-shaped object. Other appearances were then to follow in one another by cyclic waves. At the same moment, the Apollo program, headed by Werner von Braun, was in full swing. And Dr. Braun in no way favorably welcomed the demand for paranormal experiments, which nevertheless took place during certain Apollo missions. This is the last known experiment on psychic and telepathic amplification, as well as detection of psytron particles emitted by the Yogi towards the Apollo capsule. But these tests were all eclipsed by the systematic appearance of unidentified objects around orbital flights and the discovery of traces of civilization on the moon. NASA had to face an avalanche of data and embarrassing proofs. The only solution was to put everything under the cloak of defense secret. In 1971, the Jason directives set up a special retouching service whose purpose was to erase all signs of civilizations or ruins on the moon, especially in those photos intended for the general public and the press. In June 1965 has appeared this in a satellite report in the area of Deception Island, south of Argentina. The Russians tried to sabotage the refloating operation in vain, despite the violence of the confrontation.
هذه السحابة سبحان الله، لا إله إلا الله. حصلتها في المزارع في بدع فارس، يعني ما بيني وبينها إلا 5 أمتار. الحين ترد على السيارة. هذه قدر إلهية سبحان الله، نزلت الأرض الحين. فأنا مستعجب صراحة. ممكن حد يصدق أو ما حد يصدق إنها سحابة. الحين طاحت في الأرض ونشبت في الشبك. هاي لا كيف تقسمت إلى أجزاء. الحين جزء طاح منها ودخل داخل المزارع. سحابة غريبة اشتلت. فأنا اليوم صراحة مستغرب المنطقة هذه، أشياء غرايب فيها أشوفها. الحين طلعت فوق. هل تصدق يا أخي؟ الله مفطط شكل الإنسان. وقف الحين بصور هذا. الحين ما أنزل بتصور أنا في الجهة. شوف تعال جو التلفون هذا. شوف ها جود هذا. شوف جود ايوه. شوف انا خذ شوف شوف
ايوه
هذا نزلت من السماء. داخلها حفر. شكرا يا رفيق شكرا. عجائب الدنيا هاتاك في السماء يا ريت انها تتواضح.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Skywatch Media News. This is the final week of June 2017. Have you heard the latest news from the scientific community? Astrophysicists from the University of Arizona have compelling evidence which suggests that a planetary object with a Mars-to-Earth mass is most likely lurking in the solar system. This object would be much closer than the so-called Planet 9, which is still awaiting confirmation from astronomers. The orbital body has given away its presence by observations which show that it is presently controlling the orbital plane of the Kuiper Belt in the outer regions of our solar system. The Kuiper Belt lies beyond the orbit of Neptune, where a host of icy bodies and dwarf planets dwell. So the unseen mass would have to be equivalent to the mass of Mars or Earth to be capable of warping the orbital plane of the outer solar system. According to calculations, an object with the mass of Mars or Earth orbiting roughly 60 AU from the Sun, or an orbit that is tilted by 8 degrees to the plane of the known planets, would have the required gravitational influence to warp the orbital plane of the outer solar system. An AU in astronomical terms is the equivalent of approximately 95 million miles, the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So take 60 and multiply it by the 95 million, and you can see just how many miles from the Sun we are talking about here. And yet this object has the capability of warping the orbital plane of the belt for as far as 10 AU on either side. And then we are talking about something quite extraordinary here. We continue to get information in bits and pieces from the scientific community pertaining to new discoveries in our solar system. Every few months we get announcements from NASA and other space organizations that new planets and star systems have been discovered in our backyard. If there is something of significant importance to tell the world, then the disclosure must be slow and precise as a means to get out in front of the story before it becomes too obvious to the watchful eye. For decades, the public has been told that there is nothing out there. There is no Planet X or any other rogue planet that exists in our solar system. That is what they told us, and they made sure that the media reported in the same manner. But everything has changed now. They can no longer control what is happening. As things become more obvious to the public, then the truth can no longer be kept in the dark. So expect more announcements from NASA very soon, as things are really getting serious. They know it, we know it, and time has a way of revealing all things. There is a lot of anticipation for the big event that will happen later this summer. On August 21st, a major solar eclipse will pass over half of the planet. But the interesting details of this particular eclipse is that the path of its totality will bring total darkness to only one country, the United States. Solar eclipses have long been considered as harbingers of disasters for the Gentile nations. For those of you who follow the words of Scripture, this particular passage may hold great meaning in correlation to the upcoming eclipse. Now, I am not an interpreter of the spoken word, but if you study these words carefully, you may notice that the timing of this passage appears to be quite concise. So what is the correlation between this passage of Scripture and the major solar eclipse of 2017? There is something unprecedented and extraordinary that will take place on August 21st. When the sun rises on this date in the United States, it will do so in total darkness. So that you may understand, the sun will be totally dark when it rises above the horizon on that date. This event would then relate to the ending verses of the passage in Isaiah, an exact correlation if the event happens as anticipated. If this scripture holds any meaning to you, then this eclipse would have to be the one that occurs prior to the actual day of the Lord, which will happen during the Feast of Trumpets in September. It cannot be interpreted any other way. Now, if anyone has any doubts about the significance of this solar event, then take a look at how this event will play out. This map indicates the precise route of this major summer event. As you can see, it will cross over the heartland of the United States from the northwest to the southeast. The focus of this event will be squarely over the United States, which makes this an exceptionally rare occurrence in historical terms for this country. The total eclipse of 2017 will be visible from a narrow corridor, which makes the eclipse even more interesting, as you can see here. The path of the August eclipse crosses the path of the upcoming eclipse of April 2024, which is almost 7 years to the date. Does the number 7 sound familiar to you? It is the time of the day of the Lord as described in the book of Revelation. These two eclipses are therefore placing a huge emphasis on the United States. So stay tuned, folks. There are some interesting times ahead of us. If you spend time searching the internet on the subject of Planet X, you're bound to come upon a number of essays and articles that explain a possible catastrophe scenario caused by extraterrestrial sources, such as a Planet 9 or a large brown dwarf planet, which is basically a failed star. There have been several scientific studies floating around that are attempting to find evidence of its existence beyond Neptune. But since scientists remain in disagreement on whether the planet actually exists, the matter hasn't garnered much attention lately. So the theory of a Planet 9 may have gone silent in the short term, but the notion that something is out there lurking in our solar system is still very much alive. After all, something is affecting the entire solar system and potentially threatening our planet. And so an explanation must be forthcoming. It is very likely that scientists have been playing a game of deceit when they talk about Planet 9. Depending on who is conducting the study, the planet is either very real and it is creating a warp pull in the solar system, or it is still a hypothetical planet. So how can both be true? How many times have we heard critics say that if the planet were on a collision course with Earth, it would be seen by now? And yet these same people have never been able to rule out the likelihood of its existence. Here is an interesting statistic that you may not be aware of. According to the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, a report which was conducted for the British government in 2006, people are 5 times more likely to perish in an extinction-level event than by any other means known to man. Therefore, the risk of human extinction due to a major calamity, whether that be man-made, natural, or extraterrestrial, could be much higher than anyone would have ever imagined. Every year there is a higher risk of a supervolcano erupting or an asteroid strike on the planet. Both would be devastating at ground zero, but they would also kick up dust into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing global temperatures to plunge. But these are not the only risks that we are facing. What about a genetically engineered pandemic or geoengineering gone awry? Statistical models are showing, whether we agree with them or not, that the planet could see an extraterrestrial event in the form of a hazardous near-Earth object in our lifetime. Now, these models also mention calamities caused by a rogue planet, like Nibiru or Planet X.